Dear students, hello. Welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Sumit Saurabh Srivastava and as Assistant Professor, I teach at Center for Development Studies, University of Allahabad, Allahabad. Today, I am going to discuss with you all the interlinked issues of sex, gender and sexuality and emerging forms of same-sex sexualities, that is to say LGBTIQ. I will also dwell upon sexuality rights and movements which are seen as an outcome of the suppression and persecution of same-sex sexuality, within brackets we can say peripheral sexualities, by the quote-unquote dominant heteronormative sexuality. Before we begin, let me again reiterate. The paper name is Gender, Psychology, Sociology and Anthropology and the module number 32. Paper title is Emerging Sexualities Movement and Rights Debating Sex Perspectives on Same Sex. Before we begin, let me again clarify and bring to the notice that this paper primarily deals with how sex, gender and sexuality interact with each other, how these categories are superimposed within each other. To begin with, if we look into the schema of module lecture from here to there and how, the lecture will begin as follows. First, I will briefly outline what do we mean by sex and gender and its various dimensions. Thereupon, we will move towards understanding sexual orientation, which is linked and delinked with sex-gender system, that is to say LGBTIQ. Subsequently, we will move into cross-cultural discourses of transsexual identity. And towards the end, we will focus on LGBTIQ movement so as to outline the oppression and discrimination towards themselves. If we try to understand sex and gender, it has to made a point that sex is the biological and physiological anatomical identity of an individual, whereas gender is the social construction of any individual. If we detail on the sex identity of the individual, we see that there are four indicators. First is the biological and anatomical identity. Second, pairs of sex chromosomes, that is to say the chromosomes which female and male carry. So the third one is the hormonal, which again makes it a point that there are two distinct set of hormones which are denoted of male and female. The fourth one is the visible physical appearances or characteristics of the reproductive organs of respectively male and female. If we look into the gender, gender is understood as the social construction, that is to say the social coating upon the sexed body, whereupon we need to take into consideration two important thinkers, feminists. The first one is Judith Butler, who argued about gender as performativity. The second one is Simone de Beauvoir, who in her seminal text, The Second Sex, outlined and forcefully argued that one is not born woman, but rather becomes a woman. Here we need to understand that from sexual identity to the gendered identity, we often focus on the process of socialization, which again transforms or molds the biological male and female towards the respective masculine and feminine gender. We will look into it later on in more details. If we have an idea of sex-gender system, it needs to be outlined that it was Gail Rubin who in the year 1975 published her seminal work, The Traffic in Women, Notes Toward a Political Economy of Sex. However, it was in the 1991 published book, Bodyguards, wherein Epstein and Straub have defined sex-gender systems as historically and culturally specific arrogations of the human body for ideological purposes. In sex-gender systems, physiology, biology and anatomy codes, clothing, cosmetics, behaviors, affective and sexual object choices are taken over by institutions that use bodily difference to define, that is to say, gender identity. Moving forth, we need to focus on the masculine and feminine aspect of gender, and herein we have to take into consideration how sex and gender system produces and reproduces through the process of socialization the masculine and feminine. At the center is the gender, which again transforms itself and manifests itself into gender roles, gender identity, gender norms, and gender presentation or prestation or expression. In here, the gender becomes the central, wherein the male is prepared by the society and social order to be masculine in nature, whereas the female is asked to become, not asked, rather is strongly suggested to become feminine. If we look into the sexuality and sexual orientation, moving to the next issue is sexuality has long been a major issue within women's studies, gender studies, feminist theory and politics. Sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic and or sexual attractions to men, women or both sexes. Sexual orientation also refers to a person's sense of identity based on those attractions, related behaviors and membership in a community of others who share those attractions. Here it is important to underline some of the basic definitions of sexuality. Michel Foucault, in his seminal text, The History of Sexuality, has stated that changes in the way individuals were led to assign meaning and value to their conduct, their duties, their pleasures, their feelings and sensations, their dreams. However, the Brazilian gay, lesbian, bisexual, transvestite communication manual has stated that the cultural notions of pleasures and social and bodily interchanges ranging from eroticism, desire and affection to notions relating to health, reproduction, the use of technologies and the exercising of power in society. In this way, we see that sexuality has been defined primarily in terms of liking and eroticism. Moving forth, if we look into the binary of sexual orientation, going by the previous definitions, we arrive at two. The first one is heterosexual, the second is homosexual. Within the heterosexual, it can be stated that one who has significant sexual and romantic attractions primarily to members of the other sex than oneself. And heterosexuality is the most common sexual orientation in the world, but by no means normal, whereas homosexuality includes same gender attractions, lesbians, women who are attracted to women, gay men, men who are attracted to men, bisexual people, men or women attracted to both sexes. Moving forward, we need to look into how sexual orientation, the rationale of the sexual orientation has to be understood. It needs to be underlined that although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Many think that nature and nurture both play complex roles. Most people experience little or no sense of choice about their sexual orientation. Here it is important to underline some of the significant milestones within the field of heterosexuality. It was in the year 1980 that the lesbian feminist poet and theorist Adrienne Rich had coined the term heterosexuality. However, it was in the year 1991 that the Michelle Warner in the book Fear of a Queer Planet used the term heteronormativity, whereas Monique Wittig coined the phrase heterosexual contract. These are some of the milestones which are exclusively related to heterosexuality. Here it is important once again to note that same-sex sexuality can be also understood as alternative sexuality. Alternative sexuality can be understood as behaviors, identities and communities that stand in contrast and or are opposition to socially and culturally dominant sexualities. Here one more thing which is important to understand for the context of alternative sexuality is the term coming out. It is used to refer several aspects of lesbian, gay and bisexual persons' experiences. At the same time, self-awareness of same-sex attractions is also included here. It is the telling of one or few people about these attractions and widespread disclosure of our sexual identity and attitude to the world at large. Here it is important that within the sexuality debate, when we focus on the alternative sexuality and same-sex sexuality, we need to transcend beyond gender sexuality dichotomy. Now, what is understood by transcending is the following. According to R.W. Connell, human life does not simply is divided into two realms, nor does human character divide into two types. Thus, a definition based on dichotomy excludes the differences among women and among men from the concept of gender. In her seminal text, Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, Feminisms and the Subversion of Identity, published in 1990, argued and challenged us, stating that is the breakdown of gender binaries, for instance, so monstrous, so frightening that it must be held to be definitionally impossible and heuristically precluded from any effort to think gender. Subsequently, in her later publication, she argued identity categories tend to be instruments of regulatory regimes, whether as the normalizing categories of oppressive structure or as contestation of their very operation. We need to understand that we have to transcend the gender sexuality binary. When we transcend the gender sexuality binary, we come to quote unquote unbundling same-sex sexualities, which means LGBTIQ. Here it is important to note that the acronym LGBT and I community stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered people and intersexed, and is understood as sexual minority. Nivedita Menon, in her Seeing Like a Feminist, published in 2012, argued that it indicates transgressive desire of all sorts and enables a questioning of the supposed naturalness of the heterosexual identity. Thus, we see that the two critical issues which are related to the LGBTIQ discourse are sexual identity and gendered identity. It means that LGBTIQ people thus reflect sexual diversity, which refers to the maximum range of the sexuality in terms of orientation and practice. The figure in the next slide will present how the LGBTIQ is represented in the sexuality discourse. If we move forward, then we see that within the center, the center of the figure is the sexuality, which means sexual orientation, and it has four manifestations: gay, bisexual, transgender, lesbian. And it is important to note that such kind of sexual orientation, the multiple sexual orientation, on one hand questions the heterosexual being as normal and legal, and on the other hand it also questions the gender binary system. Now, we need to look into how the LGBT transcends. Lesbian refers to a woman who is attracted emotionally and or sexually to people of the same sex gender. A woman does not necessarily need to have had sexual experiences with other women in order to identify as being a lesbian. Gay, men who are emotionally and sexually attracted to other men, sometimes used to mean homosexual in general. Bisexual, a person who relates affectionately and sexually with people of both sexes and genders. Bi is an abbreviated way of referring to bisexual people. Pansexual, a polemic term referring to people whose sexual desire is far-reaching and can even be projected towards objects. Transgender, on other hand, is a terminology used to describe people who transit between genders. Their gender identity transcends the conventional definition of sexuality. They feel there is a difference between their birth gender and the gender they consider inside themselves. The last category is transsexual, a person whose gender identity is different to the sex they were born with. Transsexual men and women may manifest the desire to undergo medical and surgical interventions to focus on the physical attributes they were born with, including their genital attribute, and they wish to undergo medical procedure to change their sex. In this way, we see that LGBT, pansexual and transsexual are some of the alternative sexuality. In the core of the alternative sexuality is the term queer, which is often understood as the third gender. Queer is an umbrella term for sexual and gender minorities that are not heterosexual, heteronormative or gender binary. To identify as a queer means that the person sees him or herself as being part of the LGBT community. Transgender key signposts means that within the literature of transgender, how different social scientists have contributed. Virginia Prince used the term transgender in the 1970s. In 1910, transvestite was the term coined by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, whereas the term transsexual was popularized in the 1950s by Dr. Henry Benjamin. Dr. David O. Caldwell, a psychiatrist, used the word transsexual in 1950s to refer to those people who sought to change their sex. Later on, gender dysphoria syndrome, a terminology, was also introduced denoting those people who wish to have sex reassignment surgery. Later on, in the 1991, Sandy Stone published a paper which was titled Post-Transsexual Manifesto. Some of the other seminal work includes Michel Foucault, History of Sexuality, Volume 1, 2 and 3, Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, published in 1990, Julia Episton and Christina Straub's book Bodyguards, The Cultural Politics of Gender Ambiguity, published in 1991. It is important to note that Susan Stryker in Transgender History, published in 2009, stated that it is meant to refer those people who move away from the gender they were assigned at birth, people who cross over, that is to say trans, the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender. Here the major issue is why people trans. The responses vary. The first, some people move away from their birth assigned gender because they feel strongly that they properly belong to another gender in which it would be better for them to live. Second, others simply want to have a new quote-unquote undefined and uncharted space. Third, they wish to move away from the conventional expectations bound up with the social order assigned to them. Later on, if we move forward, then we need to understand how cross-cultural understandings on transsexuality has been understood in feminist studies and politics. It was Heath who traced its history from Greek goddess Venus Castina to first gender reassignment surgery in United States of America in 1931. Meyerowitz in 2002, while writing in the context of America, states that European scientists ventured into this area by 1920s, whereas the trend traveled to America by 1930s. This led to the emergence of quote-unquote GRS, which stands for Gender Reassignment Surgery or Gender Reconstruction Surgery in 1960s among the medical practitioners. Towell and Morgan, in an attempt to provide cross-cultural perspective on transgender, speak of Hijra of India, Bedache of native North America, the Zenith of Arabian Peninsula, the female husbands of Western Africa, and the Sambia boys of Papua New Guinea. In this regard, a phenomenal text titled In Search of Eve, Transsexual Rites of Passage, published in 1988 by A. Boleyn, is an important text. Similarly, Transsexualism in Europe, published in 2000 by a Council of Europe publication, is an important text to understand cross-cultural understanding and manifestation on transsexuality. One can here focus on the collectivity addressed as Hijra in India as transgender. We need to focus on two of the writers or feminists who have focused exclusively on them in their respective text. Serena Ninda, in Neither Man Nor Women, the Hijras of India, published in 1999, stated that Hijras as neither men nor women function as an institutionalized third gender role. Their ambiguous sexual nature, through which they embody the power of generativity of the goddess, accounts for their traditional occupation, that of performing after the birth of a child at weddings and at temple festivals. In another powerful writing, Gayatri Reddy has argued that Hijras are an important collectivity and community within Indian society. If we look into the UNDP India publication 2010 titled Hijras, Transgender Women in India, HIV, Human Rights and Social Exclusion, it is noted that in India, people with a wide range of transgender related identities, cultures or experiences exist. Now, we need to focus on heteronormative sexuality domination perspective. Here, there are three issues which are important. The first and foremost aspect of the violation of the LGBTIQ people is the labeling of the LGBTIQ people as quote unquote incomplete persons. Incomplete in the sense that they are complete, total, ideal man or women. Secondly, any kind of discrepancy is regarded as quote unquote sick, abnormal and pathological. The third level of discrimination or violation of their intrinsic right is again related to their being incomplete personhood. If we move forward, we see the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission outlines that over 80 countries currently have sodomy laws or other legal provisions criminalizing homosexuality. It also notes that apart from the inherent violation of criminalizing sexual conduct, these laws empower police and other authorities to abuse, harass, extort, imprison and execute people whose sexual orientation, gender identity or expression differs from dominant norms, and most importantly, torture, violence and abuse permit the lives of those who challenge sexual or gender norms. Moving ahead, the Amnesty International has noted that although the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does not explicitly mention sexual orientation or gender identity, however, evolving conceptions of international human rights law include a broad interpretation to include the rights and the protection of the rights of LGBT people around the world. Similarly, UN Human Rights Council resolution and discussion in June 2011 approved a resolution affirming the rights of LGBT people. Moving ahead, in the next, we can see that same-sex sexuality movements and rights can be understood as part of new social movements. These became globally visible in the 1960s and 1970s, the decades which marked by New Left, which itself was the byproduct of the civil rights movement. It has been argued that at the root of such movements was the issue of identity politics. The Stonewall Rebellion in New York City on June 27-28, 1969 can be seen as the benchmark of LGBT movement. Subsequently, the LGBT movement spread to non-Western countries through varying degrees of sexual right discourse. Within India, if we look into same-sex sexualities movement, we need to understand that health concerns regarding HIV/AIDS along with the screening of same-sex lesbian portrayal in Deepa Mehta's movie Fire, which was released in 1998, are signposts to the same. The subsequent protests by the Hindu right ideology led to the formation of Campaign for Lesbian Rights in December 1998 at Delhi. The first ever Indian lesbian group, Sakhi, formed in October 1992, and the first openly gay community-based organization, Humsafar Trust, was set up in April 1994 by the leading gay activist Ashok Ro Kavi. Moving ahead, it is in the Indian Penal Code, Section 377, that the state apparatus of Indian Penal Code that the same-sex sexualities are considered criminal acts. Though struggle against it was initiated by a Delhi-based NGO called AIDS Bhedbhav Virodhi Andolan, it was the Anjali Gopalan's Naz Foundation India Trust, Delhi, which along with others took lead in this. In an historic moment, on July 2, 2009, the Delhi High Court pronounced that Section 377 should be quote unquote read down to exclude consensual sex between adults. However, the Supreme Court of India on 11th December 2013 once again upholded the constitutional validity of Section 377 of IPC, which criminalizes the same-sex behavior. The litigations filed against the same are still to be addressed. Within the rights and entitlements of same-sex sexuality movement, we need to focus on the following: India's prominent transgender rights activist Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi, Ashok Ro Kavi, Humsafar Trust Mumbai, Naz Foundation Delhi, and the others HIV/AIDS unit of the Bhed Bhav Mitao Andolan Delhi. Within rights and entitlements, we see that it was in the year 2009 that the Election Commission of India allowed other gender identification. The government's Aadhaar program started in 2009 that gives each citizen a unique ID number, now recognizes transgender. Within the next, if we see, then we look into the point that transgenders have been recognized for the first time by the Government of India in the census 2011. As per the census 2011, there are 4.9 lakh transgenders in country. In April 2014, the Honorable Supreme Court of India recognized a long discriminated against transgender groups as a third gender. To conclude, we may say that alternative sexuality, heterosexuality, dominance of heterosexuality, same sexuality, and the interlinkages between sex, gender and sexuality, all these issues have been outlined in this module. One needs to take into account that the linkages between sex, gender and sexuality are very crucial to understand same-sex sexuality.